So we will switch to English now. We have a last speaker for tonight. So previously we've been discussing about simulation. We've been discussing about being able to simulate Earth, the planet as a whole with Asobo. We've been discussing about simulating humankind as well with Emilien. Now we will have a stronger focus on nature, probably. Thanks to Alenda Chang, who will join us today. So, Alenda is a researcher and a lecturer at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She's been through a lot, really, to be with us today. So, the story of her journey to reach Paris would probably take the rest of the evening. But really, we are delighted to have you with us today. So please give a warm welcome again for Alenda.
We'll actually go back. Okay. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for staying around. And I'm excited to be here finally after 48 hours of traveling. I did things the non-carbon negative way, so I'm so sorry. I have to buy more carbon offsets. And I'm hoping that all that French literature that I read in college will now help me in some way, but I somehow doubt reading Molière is going to help me in modern Paris, but I'll try. So the title for my talk today is The Given Tree, and it's an adaptation of a very famous English children's book called The Giving Tree, but I'll come back to that at the very end, I promise. So what my talk really is about today is models. Models are obviously, they're all around us. They can be found in nearly every field, from mathematics to medicine to machine learning. And even though they're always imperfect, they help us to make sense of the world, right? And also each other. And there's this old saying in statistics, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So if we want to narrow things down a bit, we can think specifically about models in games, right? In game design. And these are some of the questions that we might ask. And I'm sorry about all this text, but how do models, which you can define as ways of thinking about or visualizing things, how do models shape what is knowable and what actions can be taken? What are the differences between a good model and a bad model? And do models merely reflect reality, or do they help to construct reality? And how might a closer attention to modeling, specifically in my case, environmental modeling, suggest ways to redefine our relationship to electronic artifacts and the biosphere? So I'm not going to do all of that in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but we'll play with it a little bit, right? So let me backtrack a little bit. The reason I'm here is because I wrote this book. It came out, like 2 years ago now. And at UC Santa Barbara in California, where I live, I teach classes about games, about environmental media, about science and technology. And I also helped to start a media studio called Wireframe, where we really try to keep social and environmental justice intertwined and not let them be broken apart. And I wrote this book because I love video games. I grew up playing them. I also am a big science nerd. The reason I exist is because my parents both immigrated to the United States to pursue science graduate degrees. And so, I felt like I was the person to ask this question. Can games offer as meaningful a natural experience as going outdoors, right? And I know most of you are like, no, you can't do that. But I didn't say as natural an experience. I said as meaningful an experience as going outdoors, right? So, we can talk maybe later about how in other media, like children's books or films, natural representation is really declining. Whereas I think in games, if you look at them, really natural representation is flourishing, right? And I'm very interested in that. And I also think that games are now one of the most important contact zones where people encounter natural representation, right, and are encouraged to think about their interactions with it. Okay. So the talk today kind of comes out of this essay I wrote for a bunch of academics in this journal. But it's about digital vegetation modeling, okay? And before you fall asleep, let me say, I actually think this is very interesting. Let me play this in the background. Okay, so, you know, when I was writing the book, I came across a company called Interactive Data Visualization, and they have a very famous piece of software. Actually, they were bought by Unity recently, but they have a very famous piece of software called SpeedTree, sorry. And as the name suggests, people who use SpeedTree can use it across games, television, film, architecture, to very quickly create computer-generated plants, right? Or just to buy, you know, this is the nature morte, right, kind of philosophy. And I find this really interesting because there's a philosopher of plants, Michael Marder, who has accused us, all of us, of having plant blindness, meaning that we tend to, even more than animals, we tend to ignore, you know, the botanical world around us, unless it's useful to us or we're eating it, right? And so I would add that I think plant blindness is even worse in digital modeling, okay? And when I started to do this research, what I found was that there's a really basic lack of knowledge about how much computer-generated vegetation is part of our daily lives, right? And also, and I'm going to talk about that later, there's also very different design philosophies in the companies that work in this space. And I think that makes a difference, right? So, you know, these are just some of SpeedTree's clients in the game industry. This is just some of them, right? But you can see that they're not actually, they're in very big games like Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, Dragon Age, you know, big games. But you might not know they're also in television, in Sesame Street, quality television like Game of Thrones. Avatar used to be the highest grossing film of all time, not anymore because of the stupid Avengers. Sorry. And then also architecture. This is a museum in Texas. Those are actually real trees, but they use the speed trees for visualization or fly-throughs. And so, you know, I think it's all around us and we don't even realize it. And I think why is that important? Okay, so models. I include this in the kind of general realm of stock images or stock representation, right? So there's always a tension between the generic and the specific, right? And unlike things like women laughing with salad, the meme, right? Usually with digital vegetation, people still have to tweak it, right? Or maybe even do it by hand using the constraints of the software. And you know, if you look at speed trees, this is just an example I pulled of a saguaro cactus, right? You can see what you get if you buy this, right? You're going to get Carnegie gigantica. So that's what's included. There's some extras like collision detection, lighting, wind effects, seasonal variation. And if you pay a little more money, you get the ability to customize, right? So there's this tension between generic and specific. Actually, sorry about that. And there's also, secondly, there's also a trade-off, usually when people talk about this, between detail and efficiency, which is really common to all digital modeling, okay? So developers, I think a lot of you here, right, you speak the language of efficiency and optimization, right? And you were concerned with streamlining assets in a digital world to make sure that computers or graphics cards don't just break, right, when they're trying to do the rendering of all the polygons, right? And so you have to run it through compression or optimization. And this actually, the reason I started to think about that was because I did this event. You'll see this a little bit. I did an event with a Danish artist, Jakob Kunstinsen, in this world that he created, which is a virtual recreation of the island of Bora Bora. And while we were doing some user testing of the space, he joked with his development team that they better have optimized that cactus, right? They better have optimized it or it could break the entire simulation, right? And I thought, and they were joking and also some kind of serious, but I thought, that's great. Actually, I love the idea of a cactus that would break the entire world. So I'm on the side of the cactus a little bit, okay? Okay, and so obviously the emphasis on efficiency, optimization can lead to very, different aesthetic policies, right? The one I always talk about is Firewatch. I know this is a little older now, but the environment artist for Firewatch decided to model the 22 different kinds of trees in that game by hand, but then, and these are her words, instanced the crap out of them, like meaning just cut and paste very, very liberally across the landscape, right? And it's a beautiful game, but once you know this, you can't unknow it, right? So I don't know if you can see at the bottom those two little broken branches to make it look very unique. Once you see that, it's everywhere, right? And so I just think, this is not to say that the game is bad or the trees are bad, because it's a beautiful game and it's very immersive and it takes place in a national forest, right? But it starts to get you thinking about what is the importance of this background we usually ignore. Okay, and so if you go back to the SpeedTree site, their advisors will help you, and they tell you things like, oh, you should model for the shot. So when you're making vegetation, you put the detail where users are going to see it, like in the front. So that leads to funny situations where, as long as you're looking at the front of the tree or the bush, it looks great. But if you walk around to the back, it looks, it's like, it's treating games more like film, like a set on a film or a theater stage, than it really is a virtual world, even though we like to call it immersive virtual worlds. Is it really, right? And you could talk about, I know today you've been talking a lot about resource use and computational, processor use. So you could argue, well, optimization efficiency isn't a huge deal anymore because processors are getting stronger, graphics cards are getting stronger. This is from the demo of Unreal Engine, the newest engine that they released. Well, they demoed a few years ago and then they released it to the public earlier this year. And so they have this game that looks like Tomb Raider. So that's what it looks like in the demo on the PlayStation 5. And then this is what it looks like when it's rendered by Lumen and Nanite, where you can see there are literally over 1 billion triangles of source geometry in this picture, right? And they're, these are triangles the size of pixels, right? And so it's no longer even something we can appreciate like visually. It looks to me like television static. But you can make the argument. We don't have to worry about limitations, but I think that we do actually. Obviously, digital devices are very harmful in their production and disposal, so we have to make some choices about what it is that we invest in, right? But for me, actually, all this technical stuff is not the most important thing to me. Beyond customization and optimization, right? I think models bring up important issues around representational fidelity, okay? As well as these real-world energetic or computational costs. And for me, this project on modeling is concerned with a different kind of accuracy. It's concerned with the agency of the things that are represented as a means of showing respect to what is being represented. So the beings, the land, And it's more than just graphical realism, okay? So let me try to explain this a little better. So I'm less interested in visual accuracy, right, than behavioral or relational accuracy, so developmental accuracy. So there are companies like this one. This is from the German company Laubwerk, which means foliage. So some companies were actually started by research computer scientists who are really interested in botany, for instance, like this one that was started by Oliver Deussen and Bernd Linterman. And they make these images, but they do it with a real appreciation for how plants actually behave and grow, right? And it's not just like making something and then like sticking it in and like cut and pasting, right? So let me just move on to this. Oops. Got stuck. Okay. So it matters how digital plants are modeled, okay? So it matters if they respond. Do they have preferences or tendencies of their own? And it also matters whether or not the currently available plant models that we have, the assets, if they actually reflect the natural and cultural diversity of the world that we live in. So it's too much to go into here, but if you want to get into a fight with a botanist or a plant scientist, ask them if plants are fractals. I'll just leave it at that, okay? Because most of the time plants are modeled using fractal logic, right? Because it's elegant, it's easy, but plants are not fractals. I'm really interested, what would a game plant look like or be like that actually exhibited responses to behavior? And scientists call this tropisms, like phototropism, when you grow toward light or away. My favorite is this one. See if you can say that 10 times fast. Thigmomorphogenesis, right? Thigmo from the Greek word for touch. So it's like, do these plants respond to barriers, or do they even grow toward them, right? Like viney plants, if you've ever grown peas, right? This is an artist that actually does work on plant AI using viney plants. Okay, so, and then finally, it's also about representation. And in the video game design world, an asset is not just something that you own that's like a valuable thing, but it's something that goes into a game like an object, right? And, if you start to look at some of the asset libraries that exist out there, you find that they are actually very subject to cultural and normative bias, okay? So one of the things that I discovered just looking at the Unity asset marketplace was that well, I wasn't surprised, but there are way more guns and vehicles and avatar skins than there are, plants, right? That's not too surprising, but that's one thing. But also, if you start to look at it, there are way more plant models from North America or from Europe than there are from tropical or subtropical regions, right? And so, oops, sorry, not talking about asset flipping, sorry, we'll get that later. These are some of the trees you cannot find in SpeedTree's catalog that are important to me or artist friends of mine. The mulberry tree, which grows all over, the guava tree. And what does it mean that these species that are really important to us from our childhoods or from our lives are not necessarily represented in these catalogs, right? And I actually teach a class, I taught a class about modeling, and I had my students go into the Unity Asset Library and look for something that was important to them. It didn't have to be a plant, and then try to find something where there was a gap, right? And this is some of the stuff that they found. And then I made them use Blender, which is an open source modeling tool, to actually create their own .obj file that could, in theory, be put in a game, right? And so, like, I have a lot of students who are Mexican-American, so they found nopales, right, which is a very common cactus plant, but that is used in food. A Jewish student who couldn't find a mezuzah, which is, the thing that is on the door piece and has a piece of paper inside. Feminine hygiene products, not very common on asset marketplaces. I wonder why, right? Chinese traditional instruments. So I was just blown away by the stuff that they were coming up with. But obviously I'm thinking about environment stuff. So I would add things like extinct species. This is the Franklinia tree, which has been extinct in the wild since 1803. Or the Hawaiian o'o bird, which was last seen in 1934, right? So what does it mean when we maybe start to represent things that actually no longer exist in real life? Or that we may not even have an image of, right? Or a recording of. So these are just things that I'm asking. And I also think about, I have a professor friend who teaches at Concordia, Jason Edward Lewis, who started this project, Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, a long time ago. And they do workshops in indigenous communities and elsewhere where they teach them digital modeling and allow them to use the tools. And he described this story of being in Hawaii and doing this workshop, and they have like tribal elders or community elders kind of walking around. And one of them looking over the shoulder of a young person and seeing something native to their island was being made in the tool, and being very moved by that, right? Because it's not something that exists otherwise, right? And so I'm going to just go through this fast so we maybe have time to do a question or two, but I think we could talk about modeling, which is at a small scale, in relation to this big scale of world building, right? Because they interact, and I'm sorry, this is all boring academic stuff, don't worry about it. But the point of all of these things are that I like this definition of modeling, where a model is not something perfect and fixed in stone, but it's something that helps you to study something or make something new. You can have models of something or models for something. And I like this guy, Willard McCarty, because he thinks models are more like this, right? These toys, the Tinker toys, and games are a lot like this, right? So, people are all, they start to get fixated on the computational power of the computer or games, and they lose sight of how it's actually more interesting when computers are not knowledge jukeboxes like Wikipedia, but they're more like modeling machines, right? They just let us play, and they let us learn about things. Okay. And this is a quote from a veteran game designer who used to make some of the early MMOs, Richard Bartle, and he says, in virtual worlds, it's too much work to give everything meaning. So I understand that. That's why you have so many virtual worlds where you have glass that you can't break, chairs you can't sit on, grass you can't pull up, right? Trees you can't chop down. But I think this is the efficiency mindset, but I also think that this is also talking about, it reveals that world design is not just a matter of economy or even aesthetics, but to me it's also about environmental and ethical questions, okay? So what if I don't want to pull up the grass? What if I don't want to chop the tree down, right? What if I want to climb the tree or rest in its shade or come back in a little while and see what happened to the tree? And I also would just remind people that world building is not just something that we do, it's something that all species do, right? Okay, so I promise, this is the end. I said, the giving tree, I'm coming back. Do they read this in French? The giving tree? No. Okay, so I'll tell you. So it's a story about a tree, an apple tree who loved a little boy, and over the course of her lifetime and his lifetime, she gives of herself. So first it's leaves for him to make a crown and allowing him to play in her branches. But as he gets older, he desires more things, right? He wants money. So he lets her take all her apples and sell them for money. He wants a home so that he can marry and have a family. And so she lets him cut down her branches and build a house. She lets him, cut down her entire trunk to build a boat, et cetera, and at the end, he returns as an old man. He doesn't want anything anymore except a place to rest. And so she's just a stump, but she says, you can sit on me, right? So some people are like, this is so touching. And other people are like, this is bullshit. Why did she give all her stuff? So this story has been read in many different ways about this is parenting, or this is emotional labor, or this is wrong, right? But the point is that this is one of the rewritings from the Washington Post, where she says, do you think money grows on trees? No. But my point is, this tree is not too different from this tree, or this tree, or this, or these trees, or this tree. That's actually from a game called Among Trees, where you harvest stuff, where the larch is literally weeping for you. And so, I guess I'm starting to ask, what is this project of world building? Who or what gets to determine what is in this world and what it looks like? And, I think this story, I would say that these, right now, the game trees that we have are the trees that we are given, right? It's just what we have, right? But they are not yet giving trees, right, that can change over time, or that have their own agency, or that love little boys and can be loved in return, and old men. And so I think I just want to imagine a day when a game will have a giving tree, something that we could come back to and we can imagine changing over time, and changing over time with, right? And maybe be a tree that you would love almost as much as a Nintendo Switch.
Yes, thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. And I was wondering, because I'm a scientist, and when I talk about plants and trees, since I'm a soil scientist, I see more the roots than the shoots. And so I was thinking that most in the nature in video games or in a story, we don't see much what is happening below our feet. And what?
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Actually, I've been just kind of collaborating or advising a artist game designer in the UK, Henry Driver, who's making a BBC game about the soil and about microbial activity within the soil. And they made a version for Indiecade, I think, called, if you look at the Indiecade Climate Jam for this year, it's called Secrets of Soil, or Song of the Soil, or something. So Song of the Soil. So it's kind of, it's like kind of like rhythm game / experiential activity, right? Puzzle game meets, but he's very interested in bringing to life the different scale. And also interconnectedness, because it shows where the roots meet the soil and the chemical interactions. And so, I mean, you can turn almost anything into an experience like that. But how do you make it something that people will play and remember, and also suggest to others is difficult.